Yeah!
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
Good morning. Happy Friday. Thanks so much for starting your day and ending your week with me. I am Ross. Or I could say I'm Brian, and so is my wife. I don't know how many of you will get that, but I'm actually not Brian. I'm Ross. What? No. All right, I want to talk to you about the Pineapple Express. I promise you I owe you the other flood story, and we will get to that. But this Pineapple Express thing is fantastic. And the story is several days old, but it's still just as incredible now as it was a few days ago when it came out. This is from ABC News. U.S. Special Operations vets carry out daring mission to save Afghan allies. This falls into the category of the best of America and the best of Americans and what makes us great, I think. Let me just share some of this with you from ABC. With the Taliban growing more violent and adding checkpoints near Kabul's airport, an all-volunteer group of American veterans of the Afghan war launched a final daring mission last Wednesday night, dubbed the Pineapple Express, to shepherd hundreds of at-risk Afghan elite forces. So, right, the Afghan commandos, the people that we trained who ended up being the best Afghan fighters and the most aggressive fighters against the Taliban, them and their families to safety. Moving after nightfall in near pitch-black darkness and extremely dangerous conditions, the group said it worked unofficially in tandem with the United States military and U.S. Embassy to move people, sometimes one person at a time or in pairs, but rarely more than a small bunch inside the wire of the U.S. military-controlled side of the airport, the Hamid Karzai International Airport. The Pineapple Express's mission was underway Thursday when the attack occurred in Kabul. There were wounded among the Pineapple Express travelers from the blast, and members of the group said they were assessing whether unaccounted for Afghans they were helping had been killed. But as of last Thursday morning, the group said it had brought as many as 500 Afghan special operators, assets, and enablers and their families into the airport in Kabul overnight, handing them each over to the protective custody of the U.S. military. That number added to more than 130 others over the previous 10 days who had been smuggled into the airport, encircled by the Taliban, by Task Force Pineapple, an ad hoc group of current and former U.S. special operators, aid workers, intelligence officers, and others with experience in Afghanistan who banded together to save as many Afghan allies as they could. Oh my gosh. They quote Army Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann, M-A-N-N, retired, a Green Beret commander who led the effort. He talked to ABC News and he said, dozens of high-risk individuals, families with small children, orphans, and pregnant women were secretly moved through the streets of Kabul throughout the night and up to just seconds before ISIS detonated a bomb into the huddled masses of Afghans seeking safety and freedom. Holy cow. After succeeding with helping dozens of Afghan commandos and interpreters get into the protective ring of the airport, President Biden dispatched to the airfield. Forget that part. A group initiated an ambitious ground operation this week, aided by U.S. troops inside. And one of the interesting parts about this story is that apparently some of the active duty members of the military who were working at the airport at that time did little things, or maybe not so little things, to help even when they really weren't supposed to, right? The active duty people. They quote Lieutenant Colonel Manigan, "This Herculean effort couldn't have been done without the unofficial heroes inside the airfield who defied their orders not to help beyond the airport perimeter by wading into sewage canals and pulling in these targeted people who were flashing pineapples on their phones." Operation Pineapple Express. They gave these people a little pineapple to show as the sign. And that way they wouldn't be, showing an American flag or something that the Taliban would recognize. Oh, you got a pineapple on your phone? What's that, right? When the Taliban's looking at your phone. It was the signal. It was the signal. With the uniformed U.S. military unable to venture outside the airport's perimeter to collect Americans and Afghans who've sought U.S. protection for their past joint service, they instead provided overwatch and awaited coordinated movements by an informal Pineapple Express ground team that included conductors, led by former Green Beret Captain Zach Lois, known as the Underground Railroad's engineer. The Afghan operators, assets, interpreters, and their families were known as passengers, and they were being guided remotely by shepherds, who are in most cases their loyal former U.S. Special Operations Forces and CIA comrades and commanders. Isn't this wonderful? This is a freaking fantastic story. There was one engineer, a few conductors, as well as people who were performing intelligence gathering duties. The intelligence was pooled in the encrypted chat group in real time and included guiding people on maps to GPS pin drops at rally points for them to stage in the shadows and in hiding until summoned by a conductor wearing a green chem light. Once summoned, passengers would hold up their smartphones with a graphic of yellow pineapples and a pink field. Wow. Before that bombing, around 8 p.m. on Wednesday, the shepherds reported in a chat room, which was viewed by ABC News, one by one, that their passenger groups were maneuvering discreetly in the darkness toward rally points, but that suddenly, just before this attack, apparently, they were unreachable on their cell phones. So they lost communications. And there was concern that the Taliban had taken down the cell towers. But later, what they actually learned was that the U.S. military had deployed a cell phone jammer, or multiple cell phone jammers, around the airport to counter the threat of an IED, a bomb, that could potentially have been set off with a cell phone trigger. So they had put up these jammers. But within an hour, Operation Pineapple had reestablished communications with the passengers and begun moving them towards where they needed to go. That is just an unbelievable story. A little more. I love this so much. I'm going to keep going. Many of the Afghans arrived near Abbey Gate and waded through a sewage-choked canal toward a U.S. soldier wearing red sunglasses to identify himself. They waved their phones with the pineapples and were scooped up and brought inside the wire to safety. Others were brought in by an Army Ranger wearing a modified American flag patch with the Ranger Regiment emblem. One of the leaders said this is an astounding number of people who they were able to help for an organization that was only assembled days before the start of operations, and most of its members had never met each other in person. There's quite a lot more to the story, but I'm not going to read any more. But isn't that incredible? And what a remarkable thing to think about what these American veterans did, special operations veterans, CIA, people like this. What they did and the personal risk they were willing to take and how they went the extra mile to make sure that they saved these Afghans who had risked their own lives and their families' lives to help the United States military protect Afghanistan against the Taliban. So these veterans did that. They didn't need to do it. They're not in the military anymore. They're not under any orders. They just went and did it. And compare that with the feckless, spineless weakness of Joe Biden. Letting the Taliban enforce an August 31st deadline and getting out of Afghanistan before we got all the Americans out and before we got out all the Afghans that we wanted to. And despite, by the way, Joe Biden and the talking heads that are supporting him talking about how many people were airlifted out, major outlets like New York Times, Washington Post have reported that of those Afghans who have these so-called special immigrant visas, the Afghans who got these visas for working with Americans in particular, more than half of them were left behind. More than half of them were left behind. Contrast that with this highly effective small group of people that saved over 600 people by risking their own hides and getting a few uniformed military who were inside the wire to go at least right to the wire, violate their own orders, not egregiously, but a little, to help pull these people inside the wire. What a story of heroism in massive contrast to Joe Biden. There's another story that I saw. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going to give you the very abbreviated version. It's very interesting. Some of the highest value Afghans, by which I mean the people that the Taliban would most have wanted to kill, people who worked very closely with American special forces and so on. It would have been exceedingly risky to try to walk them into the airport, because the Taliban surely would have been looking specifically for some of these people who worked most closely with America. So I want to give an enormous thank you, shout out to the CIA. The CIA had this other facility a few miles away from the airport. Part of it was called the Salt Pit. And it was an area that had been in the news a few years ago, not necessarily for the best reasons, as part of sort of aggressive interrogation of enemies and all that kind of stuff. But the CIA had this facility, and it was at least somewhat defensible. So what they did was, with these super, high value, at-risk Afghans, they guided them to that location, that secret location, and then used helicopters to fly them from there into the Kabul airport where they could get out of the country. And check this out. In order to get them there with the helicopters, the CIA flew, you ready for this? Russian helicopters. Because Russian helicopters are quite commonly used by the Afghan military, which was gone and ineffective and all that. So Russian helicopters would not capture the attention of a Taliban fighter the way an American helicopter would. So they used Russian helicopters to ferry these people from a secret CIA site into the airport where they could then get out of the country. Very, very well done. Thank you to the CIA. Thank you to these veterans. Thank you to the American military. Thank you to everyone who risked life and limb in order to save these people to whom we had, I think, a sacred oath. I'm not saying we have a sacred oath to everyone in Afghanistan who wants to get out, but this subset of people who worked with us. And don't ever forget the contrast with our current president of the United States. One quick thing, I promised you a second flood story, although this is really a metaphorical flood. You may recall we had on the show a couple months ago now, Dr. Stephen Koonin, whose book, Unsettled, is the single best book about climate change that I've ever read. And remember that Stephen Koonin was the Undersecretary for Science in the Department of Energy in the Obama administration. He is not a conservative. He is not a denier. He was a physics professor at Caltech for 29 years, I think. This guy's the real deal. And his book, Unsettled, talks about how almost everything you hear about climate change is wrong. He's all about data. He's not making a political point. And there was, and I should have talked about this a few weeks ago, but you recall when that most recent United Nations report came out, once again, basically saying we're all going to die because of climate change. Dr. Coonan wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal entitled "Climate Change Brings a Flood of Hyperbole." And that's a good pun there, because obviously they're telling us that we're going to get lots of floods, and everybody, all the usual suspects, including Joe Biden, are talking about how what just happened in New York with the flooding in that area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, is related to climate change, even though the data doesn't show that. Anyway, there's a very, very interesting piece in the Journal. Again, climate change brings a flood of hyperbole. And let me just share a little with you. Previous climate assessment reports have misrepresented scientific research into the quote-unquote conclusions presented to policymakers in the media. The summary of the most recent U.S. government climate report, for instance, says heat waves across the U.S. have become more frequent since 1960, but neglected to mention that the body of the report shows that they are no more common today than they were in 1900. Knowledgeable independent scientists need to scrutinize the latest UN report because of the major societal and economic disruptions that would take place on the way to a so-called net zero world, including the elimination of fossil fuel electricity, transportation, and heat, as well as a complete transformation of agricultural methods. It's easy to see things in this report that you almost certainly won't learn from the general media coverage. Most important, the muddle continues. We are repeatedly told the models say, but the complicated computer models used to project future temperature, rainfall, and so on remain deficient. Some models are far more sensitive to greenhouse gases than others. Many also disagree on the baseline temperature for the Earth's surface. They also don't reproduce the global climate of the past, and on and on and on. And again, this is a long piece, but the last paragraph is this: good science is characterized by detailed data, proven models, and reasoned debate. That takes time. Meanwhile, we should be wary of the torrent of hyperbole that is sweeping the globe. Folks ask me all the time, Ross, what should I read about climate stuff? And I don't want to bury people in too much stuff. Read Unsettled by Stephen Coonan. Read articles and books by Bjorn Lomborg, Lomborg. By the way, a liberal who believes in man-caused climate change, but thinks that the left's approach to the problem is a much bigger problem than the so-called problem itself. We got a great story for you next.
How dare you!
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KHOW.